Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG Podcast, episode number 143 of the show. I am Ramon Mejia. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews. And this week I have 7 new LitRPG titles just for you folks at home. And that does include the title of the novel Radioactive Evolution. After that will be The Third Realm, 10 Realms, book number 3. Then it's going to be A Song of Shadow, The Bard from Barliona, book number 2. Then it's going to be Arcane Hazards, a LitRPG adventure, Demonic Summoner's Serial, book number 1. Then it's going to be Arcane Hazards, a LitRPG adventure. It's a Steel Soul, Hub World, book number 1. And then it's going to be Tournament Lord, Champions of MythRune, book number 1. And then Bard to the Bone, coming in last, but not necessarily last place. Before we get into that, though, we're going to go to LitRPG news. And it's like, no LitRPG news. It's a Thanksgiving week, not a lot happening. Most folks are heading into families, lots of travel stuff. Not everybody's writing. And there's only one actual release this today. So that's no real news, but I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. So happy Turkey Day, folks, and happy family days, and try not to murder each other and enjoy those Black Friday deals. There you go. Okay, on to stuff that is out now. This includes Fate of Camlin, book number 4 in that particular series. So if you're waiting for that, this is the 4th book. Also out now is Guardians of the Round Table, book number 3, Singed Feathers. Then it's going to be Island Kingdoms War, Evolution Line, book number 3. That's the 3rd book in that series. We reviewed book number 1, enjoyed it. Just haven't got around to reading book 2 or 3, unfortunately. Also out now is The God's Game, volume 1, Crota. That's out. Just a quick note on that one. I took a look at it just to make sure it's LitRPG. It looks like there were some formatting issues with some of the tables, which are generally hard to format correctly if you're not used to using them. I also notified the author that there are some formatting issues there and some other things. And he said he was going to try to get those fixed. So if you got a version of the story where there are those issues, probably hit refresh or check your content section in your Amazon page for an update. Okay, also now is Changing Faces and Irrelevant Jack. So there you go, all kinds of new stuff as LitRPG ebooks. We'll have one title as a new LitRPG audiobook, and it's going to be Game Changer, Reality Benders, book number 3 in that particular series. So I personally enjoyed all the books in that particular series, so go check it out. I'm sure it's amazing. In upcoming LitRPG, we got some titles here, including Luminous Lands, book number 2, Conquest. That'll be out on November the 23rd, 2018. On November the 26th, it'll be Guild. This is a LitRPG novella in the Monsters, Maces, and Magic book series. On November the 27th, it'll be Civil War, which is the 2nd book in the Rogue Dungeon series. On November the 30th, it'll be Eden's Gate, The Omen. That's going to be book 5 in that series. So if you're looking forward to that one is going to be fun, I'm sure. Out on December the 1st, it'll be Cultivating Chaos. That's the collaborative novel between Blaise Corbin and William D. Rand. Out on December the 10th, it'll be Hero, Level Up, book number 2. Looking forward to that one myself. Out on December the 15th, Redemption, Rise of the Resurgence, book number 3. Out on December the 16th, Freehaven Online, book number 3, Winter Dungeon Land. Out on December the 19th, it'll be Dungeon Mauling. That's the 3rd book in the Good Guys series. On December the 27th, it'll be Finding a Body, The Dark Herbalist, book number 4. Out on January the 9th, it'll be Level Up, The Knockout, which is a separate series from that other Level Up series. It's a side series, different character, different situation entirely. So I think it's actually based on I don't actually know for sure. I think it's based on a short story that was written in that universe. That was probably a Magic Dome short story collection. So we'll see what that's actually going to be on. Okay, on to new releases and reviews. And in new releases and reviews, we're going to begin with our first review of Radioactive Evolution, written by Richard Hummel. It is 390 pages, $4.99. It is available on Kindle Limited. Here's the author's description. How far would you go to change humanity's fate? Jared Cartwright has spent the last 2 years delving into the twisted, scarred wasteland of an Earth ravaged by nuclear war. The rich and powerful have taken to the oceans and skies on floating utopias, escaping destruction, and leaving the rest of humanity to fend off the mutated creatures that roam the Earth. To face his new reality, Jared must become an apex predator if he hopes to survive. He must evolve beyond human limitations to confront those that left mankind to die. And Jared's quest takes a new turn when he discovers dragons are real. Yes. So there you go. Full disclosure, I received an advance copy for review. I purchased a copy when it became available. Okay, so here's the review basically. This novel kind of came in just shy of good for me. And most of that has to do more with me than anything else. My expectations were not adjusted for this novel, so I expected things that it did not deliver. And so if you go into this novel, I think with better expectations or more reasonable expectations than I did, I actually think you'll enjoy the story. Like, the story itself is not bad in any way, shape, or form. It's entertaining, but there are several things that didn't work for me personally. And I'll talk about what those things are. But for me, the story itself tries to be a lot of things. It tries to be post-apocalyptic. If you look at the cover, that's very heavy post-apocalypse. It also tries to be fantasy dragon writing, which is an interesting combination. It's like writers of Pern and post-apocalyptic Earth. I'm like, oh, okay. And then it also tries to be LitRPG. And each one of those kinds of stories has different expectations. And they don't always mesh very well. And in this particular story, to me, because there are so many different expectations for those kind of stories, like not all of them are going to be met by the same story in this case. So for first off, let me go right off the bat. This is a LitRPG story. The author was genuinely seemed concerned that I wouldn't think of it as LitRPG. Like every time he talked to me about it, he told me like about the novel like well in advance, like months and months. Like, hey, I'm writing a thing. I'm going to advertise it as a gamelit, but it's, you know, I think of it as like light LitRPG. There are mechanics there. But if you don't think it is, please don't give me a bad review. Don't give me a negative score just because it's not LitRPG. and every time he sent me a message, that was definitely part of the review. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess that is my kind of reputation at this point. Like, so okay, that's a thing. But there's a progression system that appears regularly. It uses nanites to upgrade the main character and his dragon. There are options to improve physical or psionic mental abilities. Nanites are gained from killing mutated monsters, and the main character can also absorb some monster powers. It's not a deep progression system, though, so be aware of that. And unfortunately, it has no hard numbers. Instead, it uses percentages to apply nanites to traits, and those percentages have no like relatable like connection to like a hard system necessarily. For example, early in the story, the main character gets 90% nanites after killing a bunch of mutated rats. And then later on in the story, he gets 95% nanites from killing a giant worm the size of a freight train. And to me, I'm like, I feel like he should get different rewards for those things. You know what I mean? They're very different monsters. They're very different difficulties. But that's a choice of the author. And also like the way those nanites are applied in like in the character creation screen or the stat change is by percentage, like 5% to like a physical skill and another like 15% to a mental skill or whatever the case is. And so even those nanites are applied by percentage. And for me, I'm like, those percentages are related to an actual, number of like a thing. So there's no like reference points. I'm like, that always bothers me. And again, that's kind of a personal thing. And that percentages without like actual reference points, it's different. I'm like, okay, that's fine. But that, like I said, that bugged me. And also like, to me, I would have personally just loved to have seen like a slightly more detailed LitRPG system or RPG progression system. And it don't, to me, and again, this may be writer Ramon talking more than review Ramon, it didn't seem that hard to like implement. Like just having like actual nanite numbers, gain depending on the size and power of the monster, and also like a gradually increasing cost of the powers and upgrades. I think just having those aspects added to it would have really added a lot of depth to like the game mechanic system of this. Because as it is in this one, it's like, oh, he does get a bunch of nanites and they're represented by percentages that he applies. But there doesn't really seem to be any real cost, like increasing cost to like increasing physical stats or increasing physical capabilities or mental or getting new powers. So it feels a little like looser there. I'm like, oh, okay, that's like I said, it's not necessarily negative. It's like, oh, I would have just enjoyed like a little bit more depth, and it doesn't seem like it would have been too hard to implement. But that's me again. Post-apocalyptic portion. The story is set in post-apocalyptic world where the rich and powerful live in floating cities and on the oceans, which you don't see here. The main character has survival on the world below, who has to constantly search for new nanite sources to keep the radiation from killing him. However, because it's post-apocalyptic, and I'm used to like things like zombie apocalypse or like other kind of novels like that, where like resource gathering is a big thing and like survivalist aspects play a big part of the story and the tension. I was expecting that to be here too, because they can just look on the cover. It's like, oh yeah, post-apocalyptic world. He has to scavenge for resources and food and shelter and water, and he doesn't do any of that in the entire story. He doesn't. Part of scavenging is for nanites is definitely a thing. That's fine, and even for like gear potentially. But he like never has to look for food or water or shelter. And even though like there's definitely monster fighting, and that's the context out of it is there. Just like the general attitude in this post-apocalyptic world is like felt off to me a little bit. And maybe that's because I had different expectations for the story. But the main character had definitely this attitude of like, even though he's lived in like this bad world where he has to scavenge and fight for things, he has this attitude of like, I'm never going to hurt anything that's innocent and kill people who are potentially innocent. And he, on several occasions in the story, he lets people go who've just been trying to murder him and his dragon friend. But because of the situation, it's like, oh no, I'm just gonna let them go. And I'm like, okay, that does not fit very well, in my mind at least, to like a post-apocalyptic survivalist kind of scenario. Like, I just can't see Rick Grimes doing that, like towards like end of that Walking Dead. You know what I mean? And so, like I said, just a slight thing that's odd, but it did definitely like draw me down. Like, oh, I can't, not quite good for me in particular. The fantasy dragon stuff is also part of the story, and to me, that's kind of the oddest mix into the story. I definitely wasn't expecting like a fantasy dragon, like Dragon Rider is a pertinent thing going on in the story at all. When I first look at the cover, when I first got it, because again I got it before the novel blurb came out. And apparently this is like some alternative reality Earth where dragons existed since before the dinosaurs, even though there's like no evidence in history. And they went into hibernation during the fight rather than fight with humans who were starting to hunt them down. And that's like their history and why they exist in the world. And through some series of weird survivalist coincidences, the main character accidentally binds with the new dragon and can upgrade himself to superhuman levels by absorbing nanites from defeated monsters. And now his dragon companion's goal is to prepare a place for all the dragons to come back to Earth, or come back from hibernation or whatever they are. And that's just I'm like, oh, that's a storyline. And I'm like, like I said, it's an actual goal in the story, and it's a big plot point, obviously. For me, it's just like, oh, that is interesting. Honestly though, the relationship between the main character and his dragon companion, it's really good. It really is. It's probably, again, one of the most charming parts of the story, in that there's good banter, there's good character development between the two of them, and even like some plot arcs relating to like those hidden hibernating dragons. I actually thought some of those plot lines were among the best story portions of the novel. But again, that concept of combining like post-apocalyptic survivalist with LitRPG and then fantasy dragon writing stuff, I'm like, oh, that is an interesting combination. Again, depending on your expectations, this story may not be able to fulfill all those things that you're thinking of when you think of those kind of stories. Though the novel starts out with a clear, defined plot arc, it actually becomes surprisingly slice of life. And I think, again, that was one of the things, like, I was expecting this to be like a legit story with like maybe a 3 or 4 arc plot system, or 3 or 4 arc structure, whatever it is. And that's just mostly because of the way the novel is set at the beginning. There's a definite hard beginning. There's definitely an entry point into like, oh, this is where your conflict's starting, and some definitely stated goals of like, this is the things that we're going to accomplish, and this is super important to us as far as the main character and the dragon go. And like, there's this whole like beginning section of like setting up like, oh, this is the plot, this is what's going to happen. And while some of those plot lines advance, a lot of the story is just like, oh, they go fight monsters, and then they go on these little tangent adventures that just kind of disappear. And while some of those like side stories are entertaining, oftentimes I feel like they just kind of get him out. Like, you'll be going on this like side adventure, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's done, and they go back to like, oh, killing monsters. It's like, I was like, just when I was starting to enjoy that side adventure and I thought I was going to lead somewhere, it's like, nope, it just ends, and there's no reference to it again, or like there's like barely a reference or something. And for me, it's just like, oh, that's like, oh, that was just, again, managed expectations kind of thing. Just like be aware that a lot of the story is slice of life. In a lot of ways, the story, this novel, I should say, kind of feels like a lot of like short stories that are kind of put together. And that's not necessarily bad. For me, I think some of those short stories are very entertaining. Some of them are not. And some of them I'm like, oh, that's nope, didn't work for me. But like one of the best of these little short stories is at the 45% mark, where the main character finds a journal detailing about how a citizen of a now empty town was creepily turned because of this insidious influence of a local monster. And it's genuinely like a really good, like solid, like capsulated story, because it's not a big section, but it's a complete little story, and it has a definite conclusion, which is unfortunately not the case with a lot of the storylines. I mean, that they continue on, and there's something they just kind of peter off into nothingness, and they're just kind of abandoned as storylines. In several cases, like their interactions with several factions of the story, like, oh, how about a little bit of interactions, like, oh, we're just going to leave this here and we'll maybe come back to it, and I think in book 2 or 3, whatever the case is going to be. Like, you can tell like how there's plans with these storylines, but they're not really resolved in any way, shape, or form in this book. And a lot of the storylines feel like unresolved like storylines. The problem is like, and that for me is like, oh, I just wasn't expecting it. So for me, it didn't really work in that respect. Overall, though, the author, again, the author is very clear, like, don't give him a bad review score just because it's not LitRPG, because he's not saying it is. I'm like, it is. It's a LitRPG story. It is. It's a very light LitRPG story. Be aware of that if you decide to check it out. The progression mechanics, they can hit the minimum requirements for me. It is a world that has RPG mechanics. It is pretty light, though. It is still LitRPG. However, the story, while well written in several respects, it just kind of lacked focus for me. And it tried to be like too many kinds of stories all at once, and it just hit shy of good for me. So again, but that's just me. A lot of other people have really enjoyed the story. It's done really well in sales on Amazon. So definitely go check it out. I believe it is on Kindle Unlimited, so you're not really out anything if you have the Kindle Unlimited program. And there are some very unique, again, aspects of the story. Just because it doesn't work for me doesn't mean it's not going to work for you. So if you like those concepts of like post-apocalyptic dragon writing and LitRPG combined, this might do really well for you. Just again, manage your expectations about what to think of this is going to be. So there you go. Okay, on to our next review, which is going to be, oh, did I say what it is? 6 out of 10. Sorry. Book 1, 6 out of 10, Radioactive Evolution. There you go. Okay, on to our second review, The Third Realm, 10 Realms, book number 3 by Michael Chatfield. It is 666 pages. That is a curious coincidence to get that number on Amazon. It is $5.99, so very much under the penny a page price point that I like. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited. However, remember, this is one of those stories on authors that had issues with Kindle Unlimited. A few months ago, and he went wide. He stopped putting all the stuff on Kindle Unlimited, but he does have all these stories in a variety of different places. As far as the purchase price goes, this is very much reasonable. It's very much under that like ideal price point for me of like a penny a page. So this is also going to keep you entertained for a very long time at 666 pages. Here's the author's description. With the Third Realm, new challenges arise. Eric searches for Old High, while Rugrat deals with his broken mana system. For both, their path takes them towards the Alchemist Association trial. They didn't mean to get into trouble, they swear, but in the 10 Realms, trouble is not far behind the duo. They'll have to fight across the Third Realm to complete the Alchemist Association trial. However, all isn't as peaceful in the First Realm, as Alva and Vermine will face one of their greatest challenges yet. Chaos or creation, there's no knowing what will happen in the 10 Realms. And that is honestly the vaguest novel description I think I've ever seen from that author. It is accurate. Like, the main characters mostly stay in the Third Realm and doing the alchemist stuff. He does touch on the other characters in the story, which is getting kind of a nice cast. The dungeon that they established in book 1 in the First Realm, and like some monster fighting and some, a bunch of other things as well. Again, by this point, this is the third book in the series. You're probably on board by now, or you're stopped reading it. So it's going to be a much simpler, shorter review. I had a good time with it. This is a good addition to the series compared to book 2. There is definitely more action in the front half of the story. I think that's one of the things I noted about book 2 in particular. Is like, oh, there's a lot of crafting stuff in the front half, but not a ton of action. In this novel, it's kind of flipped in that there's a good amount of action in the front half, and crafting comes into play second and late into the story. There's still plenty of bad guys who are jerks trying to take advantage of bullier heroes, and they get their comeuppance. That's always a recurring theme in this series. But the novel, again, does not forget crafting. There's good sections dedicated to Eric's alchemy progression, Rugrat smithing, the dungeon group development, other crafting aspects. The only part, again, that kind of takes a backseat this time is the cultivation, and that's explained in the novel description, and that the main characters' mana pathways are messed up, so that fixing that is also a big plot point in the story. It's all explained, don't worry. Overall, good stuff, good value for the Patreon. For me, it gets a score of 7.5 out of 10, definitely good. read, good recommendation. That's The Third Realms, 10 Realms, book number 3, with the score of 7.5 out of 10. There we go. Okay, next review. The Bard from Barliona, A Song of Shadow, book number 2 in that Bard of Barliona from Barliona series. It's written by E. Dmitrieva and Vasily Mihenko. This is, again, a novel that is set in the Way of the Shaman universe. So it has all those game mechanics, and it is just different main character. Same game world, sometime in the timeline of events you're probably going to be familiar with. But, again, different place, different main character, different, even like starting races. It's a whole different thing. But it's also going to be kind of familiar if you read the Way of the Shaman series. It is 555 pages, $5.99. Also not available on Kindle Unlimited. Full disclosure, received advance copy for review. I purchased it when it became available. Here's the author's description. Every player in Barliona has heard of the Grey Lands, the land of the dead. Few have managed to travel there and speak with the heroes and villains of old. And of this minuscule number, only one Bard has managed to bring the souls of the dead back to the world of the living, the Bard of Shadow. Now it is up to her to determine the future of her race. Shall the Biota race become the full-fledged members of Barliona, or will they oppose all that lives? Hey, that's not bad, actually. That's actually a pretty good description of the novel, and like the big plot points. This is a good sequel. I was genuinely surprised by some of the places the storyline went, but it was pleasant surprises. The action and slice of life adventuring can be entertaining the entire read, especially some of the larger battles. Many of the musical references were honestly lost on me, like, oh, I don't know that song. And that's more me because I'm like, oh, I'm not super into music. But if you're into music more than me, you're probably going to get more of the references. Overall, it's just, like I said, for me, it's like, oh, this is essentially an extension of the Way of the Shaman series. And for me, it's like, oh, I've read all those novels. This one's also just as good. So, like, this novel, when it's for like a long-running series, for me, I generally just get to kick back generally because if I like this series, obviously, and I just like get to relax, get to like just enjoy the story without taking like a super ton of notes, because like the storylines have already kind of proven themselves over like 5 or 6 books as being entertaining, good game mechanics. And this is one of the series I'm like, oh yeah, this is just entertaining. It's good slice of life stuff. It's good adventuring, good action, good game mechanic progression. And for me, it scores 7.4 to 10. It's overall a good read. And that's The Song of Shadow, The Bard from Barliona, book number 2, with a score of 7.4 out of 10. There you go. Okay, next. This one is new. It is Arcane Hazards, a LitRPG Adventure Demonic Summoner Serial, book number 1, written by Sam Stringo. It is unknown pages. Actually, Amazon doesn't show how many page count is here, but it's going to be a short story. I estimated about 150 pages. It is $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. The most anticipated game of the century. A dive VR MMORPG with more ambitious than any previous attempt. Millions log in on launch day, ecstatic and marveling at the vast new world of Arcane Hazards. But there's something the players miss until they started coming back from the tutorial. Where's the lockout button? It was there before, right? Confusion turns to panic, and days later it breaks into full-blown chaos. Violence ensues, unchecked and unstopped by absent game masters at their wits' end. A few try the only way left out to them. New player Felix is going to need every ounce of luck, wit, and strength to survive. Will he find a way home? Will he discover whatever's caused all this and put a stop to it? Or will he give in and spend the rest of his days inside of a video game? There we go. And that's not really an accurate description of this particular entry in the series. This particular entry of the series kind of comes up to the point where it's like, oh, where's the logout button? And then end. That's the end of the story. And that's unfortunate because that description of the story, not horrible. Read it before. It's basically stored online. But that's not really what this is. Like, most of that is not particularly accurate. I believe that's a description of the series arc, but this entry doesn't fulfill most of that. It is, let's see. Okay, and again, this jumps right into the game world with little time spent in character creation, so the game behind the story already explained as the main character adventures. There's definitely enough information for the reader to understand the game mechanics. But again, it's one of those things like with short stories, you kind of have to decide how much information you're going to put in there, and LitRPG stories can be very text heavy, especially if you're going to put a bunch of notifications, a bunch of character trees, a bunch of damage notifications. This one does not have those damage notifications. It doesn't have mana costs. Basically anything the author would have to keep track of as the story went on is missing from this novel. The story itself, it's okay. It's nothing bad. It's nothing like to write home now either. In the end, it's mostly just a slice of life story. The main character logs in, joins a group, does some quests, kills some monsters, get back to town, find out he's trapped in the game, and then the end. That's it. That's generally what it is. And all that stuff that right there is described in the novel description. So it's not a spoiler, folks. Don't get mad at me. That all that's described in the novel description. Actually, the novel description describes more that ever actually happens in the story. There's just not really much here to grab your attention. There's no tension in the story till the very, very end when you get that, trapped in the game section. The main character in this group never really struggle, and there's also really no character development for the main character. Part of this fact is just like there's due to the fact it's a short story. And maybe this is something that the author plans in like in book 2 or 3 or 4, whatever the case is. But here, in the first novel, it very much feels like the tutorial section of a game, and a lot of gamers skip that section. So it is what it is. Overall, I didn't think this was a particularly good story. I didn't think it was bad either. And I just from the writing itself, I'm like, maybe there's potential in this series. Like, I'm definitely planning to give it a try, especially because it's a short story. I'm not really investing a ton of time when the next entry comes out. But this one just didn't quite work for me. It gets a score of 6 out of 10. That's Arcane Hazard, a LitRPG Adventure Demonic Summoner Serial Book number 1 with a 6 out of 10. There we go. Okay. Here your next one is Steel Soul Hub World Book number 1. Written by Chrissy Moss. It is 81 pages, 99 cents, available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Can a disease infect a virtual world? Jupiter finally got his hands on the newest immersive virtual reality system, and he's logging into Yavelia along with his best friend Cass. Yavelia has everything he wanted: magic, monsters, and a chance to level up. Everything he doesn't have offline. But there's something odd about his first quest, and the NPCs, and why did the developers include a play that is slowly spreading across the game? Something's wrong with Avelia, and the AI seems determined to use Juniper to right the wrong. The fast-paced liberty set in the hub world. Okay, full disclosure, received advance copy for review. I purchased a copy when it became available. This is a short story and a planned serial, and overall, again, just shy of good for me. And again, a lot of the reasons that this one isn't quite as good for me is a lot of the reason that last one was also not quite good for me. The introduction of the main character is well done, and the banter between the protagonist and his friend is nice and snarky. Good conversation, good character between the two of them. The game world is well described, well enough that you can tell the author is a gamer. And that's one of the things I actually noticed first about the story, is that there's a lot of gamer references, and they're not casual, though they're like small little details like you probably wouldn't have noticed if you yourself weren't a gamer. And I think that really adds a lot of like subtle depth to the story, even though again it's a short story. There's a decent amount of RPG details. The reader is shown the character sheet, stats, HP, mana. There's ability and skill advancement as the character's level. However, there are no damage notifications short of like the beginning of the story. And the world game mechanics, though, on the whole, felt pretty solid. Combat is a good bit of the questing in the novel, so there's actually a good bit of combat in the story. But this is one of the weaker points of the short story. The combat is only okay. It's not bad by any means, but it kind of felt a little lackluster to me. The thing that kind of lost me in the story, though, there are Cyberthriller elements that are introduced towards the end of the novel, and they, to me at least, made the game mechanics feel unimportant and honestly unapplied. It's one of the things where I suspect had damage numbers or mana or stamina costs being shown in the story, like especially in these sections with the Cyberthriller elements, like the story probably would have fell apart. It would have shown like, these main characters should have died like multiple times to these antagonists who are not following the game rules because of the Cyberthriller elements. I don't want to spoil it for you if you guys actually want to read it. So I'm being intentionally vague. And that's kind of what it is. So I'm like, that's whenever like these Cyberthriller elements are introduced to a story, and I've never seen them really done well in a LitRPG genre. It's mostly because a lot of LitRPG stories have like really hard set rules. And suddenly in this game, when there are Cyberthriller elements that don't follow these rules, it really does conflict with that feeling like, oh, the game rules are important, and the game rules are applied, and character progression matters, and the choices you make matter. They'll determine how good or bad you do by these choices and how hard you're working to get that XP. And when the Cyberthriller elements are introduced, a lot of times they're like, oh, that character's hacking the system, or they're breaking the rules, and they're becoming super powerful without working for it. And to combat that, the main characters are often described in ways in conflict in which they start also not really following the rules because they have to overcome that hacker character, whatever that situation is in the game or in the VR world, and that's why I've never really seen a lot of Cyberthriller elements work really well, and they don't work here for me at least. Like they don't break the story by any means of the stretch of mention here, but it's like they kind of just stop it from like, oh, that doesn't. I'm like almost, but that kind of what makes it not work for me. Otherwise, it's a decent story, interesting characters, good banter between them, of course, decent combat descriptions, okay game mechanic descriptions. I do plan to read the second story in the series once it comes out, again, because, it's a short story series. I don't mind taking multiple chances to see if it improves or not. And if you like Cyberthriller elements, if that's kind of your thing, if you like them, I actually think you'll enjoy this. It's just not really my thing. That's a personal thing, obviously. But for me, it gets a score of 6 out of 10. That's Steel Soul, Hub World, book number 1, with the score 6 out of 10. There we go. Next, book number 6, Tenant Lord, Champions of MythRune, book number 1 by Felix Kraft. I actually don't think there's a whole tournament out here at all. So, interesting title. It is 285 pages, $2.90. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. Oh, no, it is. Actually, I'm confusing this title with another one, so never mind. My apologies to the author. There's totally a tournament here. 285 pages, $2.99, available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Zane may be a loser, but he's no nerd. Zane Cunningham was a high school football star until an injury derailed his hopes of going pro. Now he wanders through his life with no goals and even fewer prospects. Until, that is, the day his ex-best friend Danny offers him an opportunity that could turn Zane's life around. All he has to do is play Danny's smash hit MMORPG, MythRune. How hard can that be? But there's more going on in MythRune than Zane could have ever anticipated, and he soon finds himself trapped inside the game. Some guys could take that in stride, but Zane has never been a gamer and is completely out of his element. Now, if he wants to get back to the real world, Zane will not only have to learn to play the game, he'll have to win it. And that's not really the case in an MMO. I'm just saying you don't usually win an MMO, but whatever. Okay, now I'm going to start off with saying that the early parts of the story are actually pretty good. The main character is in the game at the 5% mark, and he stays there the entire story. It starts off with him, and this is one of those points where some people are going to have a hard time getting in the story because the main character is kind of a jerk. He's hard to like. He's super selfish. He dislikes gamers actively, and he often comments in the novel about them wasting their time playing games. Why are they such losers? It's even kind of implied or said in the novel description itself. And he gets trapped in this game. And he has a unique power though. He does not die. So he doesn't. There are a few places in the story where this kind of breaks down and that he does get his character reset and he starts off again at the beginning, like in the tutorial like spawn zone. But as he's fighting monsters, he just doesn't die. And when he fights with the players, he doesn't die. He just he'll lose a limb. He'll get knocked down. He'll be bleeding everywhere. But his hit points never reach 0 and they always keep regenerating no matter how much damage he takes. And that to me is oh, that's definitely a unique power. It's definitely an OP cheat, but again, it's balanced out in the story by the fact that he feels 100% of the pain of being hurt. And so that's supposed to be the balancing, aspect of that. It's the main character's goal in the story: win a tournament and be rewarded with a special wish, or his wish, of course, is to be either able to log out or to talk to his friend, the CEO of the game, who he's hoping will get him out, obviously. He picks up a partner, a level 10 rogue, and together they adventure, quest, fight monsters. And again, that early part of the story, there's genuinely really good, mean friend banter between the two. If you've ever met people who say insulting things or make fun of their friends. But it's done in the spirit of like good humor, almost of like, oh yes, give each other a good ribbing, I think it's called. That's kind of the sense of humor here. Like it's a very kind of mean kind of sense of humor, but it's done in the spirit of like, oh, giving each other a hard time, I guess. But it can also reflect the main character's kind of a jerk personality. But it is generally like, oh, I get that kind of sense of humor. It's good banter. That's the relationship. The early part of the story is also a noob's tale because again, the main character is not really a gamer. And so the main character has to figure out or is told how the game works. And that's where the goals are revealed in the story. He and his companion go on some pretty quirky quests and kind of just have interesting adventures. And some, again, in the beginning part of the story, like before the 50% mark, some of those adventures are genuinely funny and they're interesting and they're like unique. I'm like, oh, that's kind of nice. However, after the 50% mark, that kind of shifts. And I'll get into that in a second. The game mechanics story are kind of a mixed bag. Early in the story, there's a good effort to describe how leveling works. Gain a level, choose to either increase hit HP, MP, or SP, and you get 2 ability points to spend on skills, ability trait. I thought it was a little weird. The main character could choose to only increase one of those things: hit points, mana points, or mana points, or like stamina points. I'm like, okay, it's a mechanic and it's consistently applied, so whatever. There is a mention that stats exist, both for the main character and for all the other players, but the reader is not shown them. And it's an intentional thing. Like at some point when I figure that the author of this novel decided, oh, these are a lot of numbers and these are a lot of like things to keep track of. And he decided at some point to cut them out, to cut some of these things out. Because again, they're referenced in certain points in the novel, but they're never shown to the reader, even though the main character sees them. And I'm like, oh, that's unfortunate, because it would have like added some depth to the game system and kind of made it feel a little more important in the story. The game mechanics that are shown, however, are consistently shown, at least until about the end of the story, when the main character starts getting like super OP and overpowered. He starts obliterating opponents like twice his level, and you can tell the game mechanics are at this point just completely ignored in some places, so that the story is furthered and pushed in a certain direction. I'm like, oh, okay, I kind of get why the author decided not to show like damage after certain, because it wouldn't justify that kind of advance with that kind of like ability to overcome those odds necessarily. As the story goes on, unfortunately, and again, this is like going back to the story portion of it, after the 50% mark, the story gets a little repetitive, and there's definitely a serious lack of tension or a risk to the main character, and it kind of shows as the story goes on. The main character is essentially immortal, and he uses that to win against every obstacle, or he's kind of power leveled by his companion through most situations. Because again, he starts out at level 1, but his companion is level 10, and it's supposed to be like a serious slog to level 10. But because they're adventuring, it's like, oh, all the obstacles they hit, the monsters they fight, the bandits they kill for XP, whatever case is like, oh, the main character is either just he survives because of his power, where he can't get killed, or, that level 10 character he's hanging out with just happens to power, like, kill everything. And he's gaining XP from it. So I'm like, oh, that's, okay, it's a choice. And so, but it makes it feel like, oh, that's doesn't feel like it's super important. And again, that kind of goes into this feels a little repetitive sometimes. Additionally, this is more of a thing that bothered me a little more, is that the big resolutions in the story at the end of the novel aren't accomplished by the main character, and instead they're accomplished by sudden interventions by third parties that kind of come out of nowhere, so the main character doesn't lose, or they're accomplished by magical items that have no foundation in the game mechanics. And I'm like, oh, that feels like a cheat to me. It's like, oh, magic doohickey, a problem solving, go. And it's like something that is definitely introduced in the story, but it's like, oh, at the same time, it's like you never see it again. It's like, oh, where's a small mention here, and this is at the end going to be the way that we solve the big resolution in the story, not by any actual effort by the main character. It's like, oh, that's frustrating to me, at least. And it kind of made all the preceding story feel completely pointless again to me. Overall, though the beginning of the story is entertaining, it loses me at the middle, and it definitely loses me at the end. The end was definitely frustrating. I'm like, oh, all that effort, all the stuff that happened. I'm like, and it's like, oh, he might as well just like swung a magic wand and said, plot hole Philicus, and it would have kind of had the same effect. I'm like, okay, whatever. For me though, that just made it not entertaining. However, the portion at the beginning of the story was good, and I take it into account. So for me, it's not like getting a negative score necessarily. It's definitely going to hit a 5 out of 10 for me. The end was frustrating enough to bring it beyond lower than a 6 out of 10. So it's going to get a 5 out of 10 because after the halfway point, you're like, oh, I just wasn't particularly entertained at all. But that's just me. So that's Tournament Lord, Champions of MythRune, with a score of 5 out of 10. So there you go. Okay, last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be Barred to the Bone by Sid Banks. It is 304 pages. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. And here's the author's description. What would you do if you were trapped in a game as a bard? Would you take on demon-worshipping cult? Would you charm beautiful women? Team up with said women to storm a castle and overthrow a tyrant? Hell yes, you would. James didn't expect a quick foray into an MMO game to last this long. He's fantasized about being a rock star, but he's never held a tune. Now, he's stuck as a bard. He's stuck as a bard forever. Lesser mortals would despair, but there's only one option. Become the most kick-ass bard ever. Armed with just his wits and a lute, James must survive in a game world where everything wants to kill him. Teaming up with a pair of gorgeous lethal women is first on the list. Next is conquering the world. So there we go. It's a very ambitious description, and it's mostly true though. The novel starts off right off in the game world, and it stays there the whole story, so that's definitely a plus. The main character is trying to distract himself from his personal problems. He logs in a highly anticipated VR MMO game with his friends who you never see again, and he chooses the Bard class almost on a whim, and he makes the most of his squishy character once he finds out he's trapped in the game. I think one of the early parts of the story that solidifies the game mechanics for me is exactly how different the main character has to play because of his class. The author essentially hits on all the right notes about how challenging the Bard class can be early on in character development when he has only one song, a few spells, and even fewer hit points. The main character has to approach his adventures very differently than he would if he was a glass cannon or a fighter class. He kind of has to play a lot more intelligent, and that's definitely done in this story. And I actually like that about the character because it felt like, oh, the author understands exactly the pluses and benefits of that bard class based on experience. So kudos. The game mechanics that are shown in the novel are fairly standard stuff. So hit points, mana points, you see stats, you can see character sheets, item and monster descriptions. Progression happens when the main character levels. He's given stat points to spend, and he's able to choose new songs and eventually spells. Additionally, there are actual damage notifications, and that really helps again solidify just how non-combat oriented main character is according to like the actual numbers in his class system, as compared to the warriors in the story who do like much more hardcore like slashy, blunt damage when they're fighting. The main character's damage is very negligible compared to those guys, as it should be for this particular class, who's supposed to be focusing on charisma and singing songs that buff people and that kind of stuff. The story itself is fairly slice of life with the main character and his lady companions adventuring until about the halfway point in the story when there's a little bit of a cyberthriller element is introduced. And for me, this particular cyberthriller element does not take away from the story though. And it's mostly because it's done almost in this dream sequence that doesn't impact the actual game world, really. And that, for me, that's like, oh, this is more of a cyberthriller element. That's, oh, this is like maybe a later plotline that's going to develop in book 2 or 3 or whatever the case, or like a series plotline. That's not really addressed in this story, and it doesn't break any of the game rules either, because it's almost an isolated event outside of the game, like general game world. So there, I don't mind seeing it. Let's see. But at that halfway point, the main character gets more serious about his challenges, and the antagonist using his unique skills as a bard to advance those or resolve those conflicts. One of the few places where the story fails for me a little bit is in describing the music. Honestly, I think I've been ruined by other LitRPG bard stories, but this one doesn't quite capture the love of music that I was expecting from it. The main character plays pop songs, and he remembers that he remembers from the real world, but he's never had any real life music skills. And he doesn't really seem to love music that much. He's just like, oh, I'm going to play like Thriller during this scene because I want it to be like a good dance song, and, you know, to have this particular bard effect that he's playing, or, you know, whatever other pop song he's thinking of that moment. And for me, it's just, and that's kind of the extent of the musical selection. It's like, oh, he says a name of a popular song, and the other characters get really excited, like the other players, because they recognize it. And but for me, I'm like, oh, I don't know that song. Or it's like there's really no description, like, oh, how he loves it, or why that music impacts him, or what emotions he has tied up into it. And again, this is mostly because I've read other like bard stories, like the Weird Bard, that do that particular love of music scene super well. Even for me, it's like, oh, I empathize with that character, and I empathize with that love because, you know, it's so well described. And that doesn't really play here in this particular story, unfortunately. So again, just a managed expectation for me. Again, it doesn't it doesn't ruin the story. It has, all the other things are still really good. It's just like, oh, I had expected more because of the other bard stories I've read. Overall, though, this is a good story. There is good action, some unique and sometimes very funny quests. Nice character development between the main character and his romantic interests. If you look at the cover, the author even describes in the description that there are minor harem elements, and there are. That's true. Most of it is fairly just like romantic-ish. There is one sex scene in the story that happens at the 82% mark. It's not particularly graphic, and it's really just like a couple paragraphs, and then it kind of fades to black, and it's really skippable. There were other scenes before that where it's like, oh, he's gonna start some foreplay, or they kiss, but then he's surprisingly interrupted by some like evil murder or whatever, and it's part of like the funnier part of the story. So there's not a lot of there's, like I said, only one sex scene in the story, so it's not a huge harem element that's really developed here. It might be something that's advanced more in the next books, but I didn't really detract for me because again, it's one scene, totally skippable, so that's fine for me. But there's plenty of flirting between the main character and his romantic interest, and even some, again, passionate kissing, but it's not a huge part of the story. Like, it's really relatively, like, I'd say less than a total of 5% of the story is devoted to that harem-ish romantic aspect. For me, it was enjoyable. It gets a score of 7.4 out of 10. That's the Bard to the Bone with a score of 7.4 out of 10. So there you go. That's it. We are done. That's the entire show, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, if you want to follow us, you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Patreon, and our webpage at LitRPGPodcast.com. And if you want to support the podcast in any way, shape, or form, you can find all the ways to do so at LitRPGPodcast.com/support. Because remember, the show exists for you, because of you. It is free. It is free of ads because of you folks at home who support us in all kinds of ways. So thank you, everyone. And until, folks, we can hang out again. Thank you for listening to me talk about LitRPG, and it's a subject that I've loved for such a long time, and I'm happy to be able to discuss it with you and to talk to you. So feel free to comment on the show about things that you enjoy, things you want us to read here. So thank you very much. And until we can hang out again, folks, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.